My name is Kelly Baum, and I'm the John and Mary Papajohn Director and CEO of the Art Center. Thank you for joining us for the inaugural program associated with our 2026 Iowa Artist Exhibition with Henry Payer. I have a particular fondness for the Art Center's annual Iowa Artist Exhibition. It's a moment to applaud the extraordinary creativity that lives in the state of Iowa. Here at the Art Center, we often say that we bring the world to Iowa and Iowa to the world. We make good on that last promise at times such as these when we focus attention on the exceptional artists who live and work in Iowa, putting the local into dialogue with the regional, national, and international. Today, we're thrilled to welcome Henry Payer, who lives and works in Sioux City, to the stage for a conversation with Associate Curator Beth Gollnick. I met Henry not long after I started working at the Art Center in 2023. I was introduced to him not in Iowa, but in Denver, at a convening of artists and scholars at the Clifford Still Museum. When I learned that Henry lived in Iowa, I immediately thought of him for our Iowa Artist Series. But Henry's importance extends far beyond the boundaries of the state. He is an artist of the world, first and foremost. Henry, who is a member of the Winnebago tribe of Nebraska, studied at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, from which he received his BFA in 2008, and the University of Wisconsin-Madison, from which he received his MFA in 2013. In 2018, he served as the Elizabeth Rubendahl Artist in Residence at the Great Plains Museum in Lincoln, Nebraska. And in 2022, he received a fellowship from the very prestigious Joan Mitchell Foundation. Henry draws on a multiplicity of traditions, conventions, and languages, some European, others indigenous, to explore the past and present of the Ho-Chunk people. Henry is very much an artist archivist. He draws inspiration from found pictures, text, objects, and materials, including photographs of Native peoples, ledger paper, and reproductions of the Winnebago chieftain RV. The past and present are recontextualized, mixed, and recombined in Henry's work. The items that Henry uses as a basis for his art have just as much meaning as the techniques he employs. According to the artist, collage, the act of assembling disparate elements from disparate places, is a potent metaphor for the acts of removal and displacement to which the Ho-Chunk people, like many indigenous peoples, have been subjected. When you walk through the galleries devoted to Henry's work and know that his exhibition is featured in two buildings, the L.A.L. Saarinen building and the Richard Meyer building, you have to catch both galleries, you will be struck by the rich materiality of his collages and sculptures, by his canny exploration of vision, popular culture, mass media, and photography, and by his unraveling of propaganda and the history of American imperialism. You will ponder the dynamics of belonging and dislocation, resilience, and disempowerment. The story of indigenous survival is front and center in Henry's work, and there is much to learn from his collages and sculptures, and also from him, which you'll have the chance to do in a moment. I want to thank Henry Payer, our Artist of the Hour. It's an honor to serve as a temporary home for your work. It's an honor to welcome you to our stage. I also want to thank Associate Curator Beth Gollnick, who curated Henry's exhibition in very close consultation with the artist. In addition to the creativity, brilliance, and hard work that bring exhibitions like Henry's to fruition, it takes a universe of generous philanthropists. Art Bridges Access for All and the Principal Foundation ensure free admission to our galleries and programs, including this program, as do the contributions of our trustees, honorary trustees, and members. The Meredith family provides legacy support for all aspects of the Art Center's operations, programs, and exhibitions. I thank and applaud them for their visionary philanthropy. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the stage artist Henry Payer and curator Beth Gollnick.
All right, Henry, I'm so excited to get to have a chance to talk to you today. And I wanted to start out by asking you about a term and a symbol that appears frequently in your work. Can you speak a little bit about the term Winnebago, where it comes from, and how the Winnebago RV came to be something that, we have on the screen right now, such an important symbol in your practice?
Say hello to everybody, first and foremost. Thank you for coming out. From my understanding, the Winnebago word is a Algonquin word in origin, and I was told it was the Menominee who had contact with the Jesuits in 1634, and at that time, the Jesuits were asking, who was further down south of the river at Green Bay, and the Menominee told them the Winnepico. So the Jesuits, recorded that, and he asked them, what does that mean? Who is that people? And the Menominee told them the Winnepico are the people who live on the foul-smelling lake, referring to Lake Winnebago. And the French, in turn, kind of bastardized it and anglicized it and kind of referred to us as the foul-smelling water people. So there's a kind of negative connotation that comes with that word through that misrepresentation or misspelling of the word, and how we kind of are attached to those things is historically, but also in our own way. We have that I think cultural aspect of living as neighbors with our Menominee relatives, and them kind of giving them information about just a people who lived at a place name, and kind of referring to us, as the stink people, kind of gave us negative connotations. So I kind of want to bring that out first and foremost in terms of the historical relevance of that word. And then it just kind of rolled, and it becomes what it is now. We have historical connections to it in terms of the places we have been relocated to. Here in the state of Iowa, the Winnebago County, the Winnebago Motorhome Industries is located on the Winnebago River in Winnebago County, which also flows north to Winnebago City into southern Minnesota, where our relocation was at in Blue Earth. So it's one of those long kind of historical, that transmotion that we talk about. It kind of brings all those things out with just that one word.
I think seeing the Winnebago appear in all these different ways in your work, I know that you had told me the story of being called the Wandering Winnebago, and I wonder how you understand that as part of the way that you're depicting the Winnebago. Like, who is represented by the Winnebago, and how is it related to this larger history?
Yeah, in terms of our relocation and removal, we were removed a total number of 6 times, depending on how far in history you want to go. But starting with the loss of our lands in southern Wisconsin, being removed here to northeastern Iowa, and then having to be removed again to northern Minnesota, and then again to southern Minnesota, and then again to south central South Dakota, and then finally to northeastern Nebraska. But throughout all those physical removals, the people in Nebraska would wander back or walk back to Wisconsin. And then from there, the government officials would round them up, put them on boats or on the trains, and then send them back to Nebraska. And then they would just walk back to Wisconsin again. So you got to imagine people in northern Iowa or southern Minnesota, were seeing droves of indigenous Ho-Chunk people going by with their buggies. This was a time of transculturation and utilizing other, the horses and the buggies and the covered trailers. So you would see Ho-Chunk people going by with all their belongings, moving back eastward. So they kind of dubbed them the Wandering Winnebago out of just that historical context of being, relocated so many times.
I'm always very interested to talk with you about the different archival references in your work, and I think that we've talked a lot while you've been here, we've been talking about different thrift shops in the area and that you might be going to them. And I was wondering about how you find the old photographs, the old postcards, all of these materials that appear in your work. And also, how do you think of the significance of incorporating these kind of older materials, these materials from the 19th century into your collage?
Yeah, I just kind of started going to antique stores and gathering materials in flea markets and trying to find, for the most part, site-specific materials. And this was during my graduate studies, so trying to, in the same vein of what my ancestors were doing, I was traveling to Wisconsin-Madison to grad school, and I would travel back to Nebraska. And in that travel, I would stop at, northeastern Iowa here at Decorah, Iowa, or in Waukon County, or Alamaki County up there in Winneshiek counties, and try to find things that actually had those print written on them, to have that physical, historical connection to physical places that we have been relocated to. So it was started out that way, and then somewhere along the lines, I found out about eBay, and that made it 100 times more easier. I mean, you just can do it from your house now. You can just type in Sioux City, Iowa, and all the stuff will pop up. I'm not going to tell you my secrets, but there's some things you got to do beyond that. That's kind of generally how I find these things, and utilizing them for their historical context as well as to reference that history from a cultural standpoint.
And can you tell us a little bit about the stereograph? You use a very specific type of photography that appears in your work. There's actually a work behind us right now in this kind of double image. And can you explain a little bit about what a stereograph is and kind of how it's inspired works like the one that we're looking at right now?
Yeah, the stereograph started out as a kind of a challenge for myself. I became aware of these by visiting, the various historical societies as well as public museums. And Sioux City Public Museum had a great collection of these stereographs by photographer James H. Hamilton, who was a photographer in Sioux City around the turn of the last century. So he would come and document the Ho-Chunk and the Omaha and the nearby surrounding tribes through the stereographic process, which is two photographs taken 2.5 inches apart. That's the average width of your eyeballs, and it kind of created a three-dimensional, composition that you could, put into this little stereographic finder and kind of mess with the closeness of it, and it would become a three-dimensional image. And you can kind of sit in your chair and take a vacation. You can look at pyramids, but I specifically was interested in this photographer's work because he documented my people at the turn of the last century and the transculturation that was going on. And this was different from other photographers, James or Edward S. Curtis, and how he was staging things. Whereas, he was kind of coming and documenting at the time with permission, I assume, that he was getting from, the tribe or people of, in the community to take photographs and document that process. So I just try to retain that as a cultural reference to show the different ones. This was also one here of a gray wolf.
Thinking about the kind of symbolic materiality of your work, in addition to bringing in these archival materials, you also work on ledger paper. And can you speak a little bit about the history of ledger paper? And also, in your practice, it has this sort of very interesting and different valence than it might in the work of other artists. So if you could talk a little bit about your process of using it and how you think about ledger paper in relationship to contemporary Native art.
Yeah, I've always been a fond of ledger art in general. Growing up here in Nebraska and Iowa, you kind of are aware of it to some degree. And it wasn't until I went to undergrad that I was going to give it a little bit more background information. And at the time, of my understanding, it was in the 1860s when the U.S. government was kind of fighting the tribes in the Southern Plains, the Cheyenne, the Comanche, and the Arapaho, the different peoples that were occupying the areas in the southern, half of the United States. They would round them up and then ship them to Fort Marion as prisoners of war. So in turn, these prisoners of war were given accounting books, ledger books, and colored pencils, and things to document their former lifestyle as well as the current changes they were experiencing. So in some of these ones, you'll see courting scenes, you'll see hunting scenes, but also you'll see the coming of the railroad and the trains, the locomotives, as well as like box houses, in comparison to the teepees or lodges that they were initially living in. And, after they would draw on these ledger books, the tourists would come and visit them. And to offer them some type of incentive, they would buy the ledger books or the pages. And I kind of theorized that at that point, once they put those artworks on the wall, those signed artworks by those artists, that's kind of the contemporary advent of contemporary Native art, because we can say that contemporary kind of means contact. You're given a whole different new set of materials as opposed to drawing on animal skins or birch bark or inscribing into pictographs and petroglyphs. So you're kind of giving new materials to an old way of life. So I kind of like to reference that art historic within my work, and to try to be a little bit different from my peers. I cover the entire page on some of the other works in the books that you see. A lot of contemporary ledger artists will allow the words and stuff to kind of appear through their drawings or their works of art. But I kind of like to have that conversation of why would we, want to glamorize, that kind of colonization. Let's talk back to that. Let's cover that up. Let's move beyond that. So I try to, be a little different from my peers, especially since, it is whole chunk aesthetics over, kind of Great Plains aesthetics in terms of our being relocated from a woodland people to a Great Plains people. So that's, for the most part, that discussion, yeah.
One of the other materials that you use as the base of your collage is U.S. military blankets, these rough wool blankets that you'll see in the gallery. And can you say a little bit about, how you find this material, what it means, and how you think about it as related to the other materials in your collage?
So the works on wool is a process I like to call the historic superimposition, something that you're placing a previously established worldview over an indigenous perspective. So they're kind of coming through with that military blanket, these GI issued blankets that were given to the children who were taken into the boarding schools, as well as the whole military expansion of forts and garrisons and what that meant on indigenous lands. The reaping of natural resources, as well as the conquering of the landscape. So I kind of use it as a conceptual connection to that, and I like to add that cartography aspect of it. Map making. How can I build a visual narrative that speaks of displacement, relocation, as well as the land that we reside on, and in what ways can we kind of take that back? Through gestural mark making, symbols, mnemonic devices, that can have relevance to me and are specific to me, but as a viewer, you can also bring your own kind of preconceived notions to these and develop another story within that. So I like to play with that type of narrative in terms of how we build these landscapes.
I've really been struck by this idea when you talk about your work and you call your collage a landscape. And if you could say more about that, about how you think of the works as landscapes and how that relates to, I know, the use of window frames too in your pieces.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's generally trying to look out the world through a window and to try to place yourself as within the context of your neighbors. These types of windows, they act as doorways or something that you're able to see. So I like to try to bring these certain elements to the works beyond just the visuals, you know. So with speaking on land, it's always something that I have to acknowledge in terms of our physical displacement, but also our constant, you know, need to move forward historically, contemporarily within our modern lifestyles. So I try to balance that within the works, you know, especially with how I reference the land. You know, I you know, come from that type of background, you know, the you know, kind of living on the reservation and having that access to everything around us where we can just run in the woods or, you know, go to the creeks or, you know, and kind of have that freedom and to try to translate that into the works. I think, you know, through the gestural mark making and you know, trying to further develop what I feel like is a response to, you know, that type of living lifestyle, life ways.
I'm really interested in the ways that abstraction functions in your practice, and also thinking about references to the way you change strategies used by European artists and their kind of representations in their work. And I was wondering if you could speak to kind of how you're turning and changing the work of contemporary European or American artists.
Oh, I always try to find the balance. Like, that's a big thing about me is the balance of the work in terms of especially the influences and inspirations. You know, coming from that background, the Institute of American Indian Arts was very native oriented and allowed us to be well versed within our own cultural artifacts and history, as well as you know, what was going on simultaneously in, you know, the isms of modern art. You know, they would be like, well, this was what was happening in native art, contemporary art. And so that type of, you know, trying to really thoroughly understand that, especially when I got to grad school, my peers were having, you know, the conversations that I wasn't really necessarily up to date with in terms of those, you know, postmodernism and whatnot. So I really tried to dive into art history to try to bring out ways to talk about our experiences. And I found that through, you know, modern art and postmodern art as a you know, utilizing it as an American voice so that I could talk to, you know, people like yourselves so that you had a basic understanding that you could come to these with. So I tried to, you know, utilize them in terms of their techniques and how can I speak to the viewer, you know, what's the most instant way that I can, you know, translate a message in terms of, you know, symbolism and mark making, color schemes, figures, you know, it all kind of coalesces into that, you know, contemporary expression of how I see it, my perspective, you know, with all that type of, you know, historical knowledge.
One of the things I love about seeing your work is seeing this juxtaposition of historical references with contemporary references. And I think this is good timing too, because we have No Place Like Home that we just saw on the screen. And so talking a little bit about how you use sort of branding, contemporary references, pop culture, how does that fit into the collage, and how does that relate to the historical pieces? Do they talk to each other? What is kind of the meaning of putting those two things together?
For the most part, I really feel like it's just trying to be humorous, or in what ways can I activate humor within my work so that it's not such a loaded message. You know, having these things such as, you know, the Dorothy slippers allows the viewers to kind of come to their own conclusions about this naturally without having to be so blatant in terms of our, you know, our dark history that we have. This is one of the things that we always have to try to balance again in terms of our historic traumas that we carry. You know, these things that are apparent within our histories in terms of our shared collective stories that we all have here as Iowans, as Americans. So it's one of these things where we have to be conscious, and I try to utilize that in that way so that you can come to these things without feeling so bad about your ancestors' choices and the things that have happened within history, because it is such a difficult thing to have to grapple with. And as an indigenous person, this is a constant thing that I'm dealing with. So any way that I can make it more clearer and help you ease into it, I feel like you, the viewer, ease into it. I think that's a successful attempt on my half.
So there is a piece in the exhibition that represents a new direction in your practice, and this is Watch the Canoe that you can see in the atrium of the Meyer Building. Can you talk a little bit about the process of thinking about how to create that piece? I mean, we went through together sort of this process of it coming together and your experimentation, and also tell a little bit about the story of the dugout canoe as a symbol for you and in the history of the Ho-Chunk.
Yeah, so the work she's referencing is the paper mache sculpture in the atrium. It's in the form of a dugout canoe, and it's one of these things where we reflect on our oral history and kind of the stories that we were told as children, especially within our the Ho-Chunk in Nebraska. During our relocation to Crow Creek, South Dakota, it was a desolate area, to say the least, at the time of the 1860s, and it wasn't prepped before the Ho-Chunk people got there to accommodate 2,500 plus Ho-Chunk people, and many starved, many died of exposure. So there's kind of that dark aspect of it. But I think the Ho-Chunk people were very proactive in taking the next steps, and they dug out canoes out of the cottonwood trees and floated downstream past Fort Thompson, past Fort Randall to the Omaha Reservation, where we reside today. And they kind of camped there for the first years, and then was allowed to purchase lands where we now have the Winnebago Indian Reservation in northeast Nebraska. So that's kind of the oral history aspect of it, and I wanted to have something that connected me to that further than just making visual images and visual narratives. Like, how can I really articulate that through modern materials? And I think that's a big part of why I made the dugout canoe out of paper mache and concrete. I wanted to have it something that was stationary, that was showed our permanence within our reservation, but also could speak to a contemporary aspect of what we are doing in terms of these art forms. There's a resurgence in creating dugout canoes within both our community and the Ho-Chunk Nation in Wisconsin. So it's one of these things where I wanted to have that be a symbol of our plight, as well as something that we can look to as a symbol of our perseverance and survivance. These are things that we constantly have to reflect on. And I think personally, it was just trying to find the time to make such a monumentous project. This was kind of something that I started in 2019, and through the process of trial and error, I kind of had to learn that some of these projects require more time, more thinking, more space, different resources. And so it was a great opportunity to have it be shown here. So I thank the Des Moines Art Center in that regard for allowing us to make that work possible. So it was a big undertaking, and like I said, trial and error of consistency and forms, drawing times. I mean, there was a lot that had to go into that, but I'm very much pleased with the outcome, and I hope that everybody has a chance to see the sculpture downstairs.
Can you speak a little bit more to the idea of survivance? I think that's a Gerald Visner idea, and tell the audience a little bit more about how that idea functions within your practice and how you're thinking about that concept.
The concept of which you're referring to as survivance is from Cree author Gerald Visner, Anishinaabe author. So it kind of has to deal with how, for the most part, it's under the guise of, native transmotion, and how these things are, involved within our cultures more so than we think, like, songs and place names and these things that we have in terms of our languages, I guess you want to say, and what that means to us in terms of how we can be translated to different places or having that ongoing cultural continuity through art forms as well as, songs, dances, and ceremonies. And it can be a very loaded term in terms of how we, survived, but also the ongoing presence we have. So it's a combination of words that, I think as a indigenous author, he was, utilizing the English words to make a better word, which is a very indigenous thing, to make something better. So I really appreciate that, and I found out about that in grad school, and it just kind of clicked. It allowed everything to kind of, really spoke to what I was trying to do. Because I think a lot of the times I was searching for answers that, non-native authors were trying to describe but didn't quite get to. And so, finding other authors within the indigenous realm really kind of helped bring that, scope to life.
I have also been thinking about the idea of transculturation, which you mentioned a little bit earlier when you were speaking about kind of finding these photographs and these postcards and seeing members of the Ho-Chunk in this transitional moment. And I think about this idea too in relationship to your work, where you're kind of combining this historical material with this contemporary material. And if you could speak a little bit more on what transculturation is and what it means for you, I think, to have transculturation be something that is a theme in your own collages.
Yeah, I really think it's just, the combining or the accessing of for me, it's that technological side of how I'm looking at these things. I want to say, a lot of the way I express my art is how can I best execute an idea. And so in terms of transculturation, it comes from those modernist types of artworks that speak to me in terms of like, the Basquiat and like just using found objects and visually seeing what they were doing in terms of their artistic output. And for myself, it was like, how can I utilize that without, for one, just being inspired by them, but also in turn utilizing their thing to make my point or to further my own worldview or perspective or how I translate my ideas. So it kind of evolved, just by utilizing those kind of desperate elements, found objects, site-specific materials, anything that can make a mark is kind of, within my toolbox in terms of how I can create work, conceptual connections, and, the symbolism that I invoke within the works are all, parts of that, that I've, gained access to just by, referencing certain artists and trying to, for the most part, just better my own technological or technique-wise, I think is what it is.
We talked a little bit about it already, but I wanted to ask you again about humor in your work. And I think in working with you and kind of understanding some of your references, I have this moment where I think like, oh, that's very funny, but it's also very dark, or it's very wry in the sense. And I was interested too, if you think of that as something that is coming from sort of you. Do you think it's cultural? Do you think it's both? Do you think that that kind of humor is able to, as you said, kind of reach out and have other people understand these kind of hard topics? So.
Yeah, just native humor in general, I think it can be, kind of off-putting if you're not in on the joke. So there's kind of things where you're, as a native, artists, it's I think we have it a little bit more because we are able to visualize and make images. So it's really, how can I, utilize that, efficiently, and to allow the viewer to, come to their own kind of, terms with these, whether they have, the preconceived notions on a negative, weight of it, or they can come to it, with a better understanding in the positive way, as wanting to further educate themselves or further learn from these things. So that humor can build that, bridge, can kind of, make that gap, something that we can find a commonality between ourselves with. But also, I think, just that kind of self-deprecation that we kind of all have, that humor of ourselves, within our people. Like, it's one of those things where within my community, you get around people and you see a lot of people smiling and laughing, and we have this very dark history that we come from, but, we kind of allow ourselves to kind of utilize that for, the humor. So that it speaks to us a little easier in terms of how we translate our own, dark historical traumas, whether personal or, historical. So I think, that kind of allows us to make those obvious connections of what we want to move forward with.
It's good timing, too, to see Superman moving the Winnebago back to Nebraska. I also wanted to talk a little bit with you about the title of the show, because you came up with the title of the show, and you came to me and you proposed Aagakinąk Haciwi, We Live Opposite Each Other. And I wanted to have you explain a little bit about kind of the valences of that term, and if you could explain to everyone a little bit about, in Ho-Chunk, how that is constructed, how that sentence is constructed, and how that relates to the exhibition.
The title of the exhibition, Aagakinąk Haciwi, refers to sitting opposite one another, living opposite one another. The root word Aagaki is to be opposite, and then we have we have positionals within our Ho-Chunk language. Our language is perception based, so depending on if you're standing, sitting, or moving or lying, that lying motion is also, it goes this way, so you're also moving or lying there. So there's positionals in how we talk. So Aagakinąk is a sitting position, so they're sitting opposite. And to add the next word, Haciwi, Hachi is a house, a lodge, and we is like you pluralize it. It's just kind of the way we pluralize it before. It's coincidentally is we. So Haciwi, Aagakinąk Haciwi is to live opposite one another. And I kind of wanted the exhibit to have that indigenous phrase, and how can we translate it in terms of how we are presently living. There's a lot of ways to look at it in terms of myself on a personal level, to live opposite my own reservation. I live in Sioux City, Iowa, which is on the opposite side of the river of the Winnebago Indian Reservation. So I'm kind of opposite my own people. But also, if you look at the way the Ho-Chunk people are, there's a Winnebago tribe in Nebraska, the Ho-Chunk Nishochachi, who live on the northeastern Nebraska. There's the Ho-Chunk in Wisconsin, the Ho-Chunk Wazi-Chahachi, the Ho-Chunk who live in Wisconsin, and we're separated by the state of Iowa. So we're living opposite one another in that regard as well. But also as Iowans and Nebraskans and Minnesotans and Wisconsins, and we all kind of share that type of opposing. You're just on the opposite end of me, and I didn't want to have the negative connotations of being opposite. That can bring the negative aspect of being opposite of one another. I wanted it to have that common ground, where shared space, we're in a commonality as opposed to being opposite. So it kind of has an open end to it in terms of how it translates, but I think that's a great way to allow people to come to these things with a better understanding of not only Ho-Chunk history and culture, but understanding the language. So that kind of allows us to build another bridge, another connection that we can all share as, you know, Iowans, as Nebraskans, and you know, our community is what we ought to be, you know, acknowledging in terms of how we all share space.
Well, I think that with that, I would like to thank you for sharing space with all of us here today, and just really say how much I've appreciated having the opportunity to work with you on this project, and how much I've been able to learn from, you know, this beautiful idea of sitting opposite. So in that vein, if I think now we might open up to audience questions, and so that you can ask Henry a little bit about sitting opposite him and what's on your mind.
And per usual, we have microphones on either side of the theater, so you can just raise your hand and Caleb can pass a mic to you on that side. I'll pass a mic to you over here. And I know it always takes like a minute to get your questions ready, so I have something that I can pose to Henry, and we're not at the greatest time in the slide carousel here for my question. But as a mom of two minor children, when you were talking with us the other day when we were learning more about your exhibition, there was an image that had the dots put over faces of the children, and you talked about the position of children in the Ho-Chunk people, and I thought the audience might like to hear some of that significance in those choices.
The specific work she's referring to is the matriarchy, and it has the three women, and they're holding children, but their faces are obscured by colored dots. And the colors are symbolic of the clan, the Bear Clan and the Ho-Chunk culture, but also personal reasons is you know, having children myself is one of the, you know, to protect our children are sacred, but also to allow them their own, you know, privacy and, you know, consent. So in terms of their lives, you know, you want to be able to acknowledge them and respect them so that they have the choices. They can make the choice in terms of being present and kind of, you know, furthering that lineage of how we respect or hold our children in reverence.
At what age did you realize that you had this talent for
There we go.
art? And how were you encouraged to continue on in this path?
I always think about it, you know, I've always draw, you know, as a young child, you know, my earliest memory is you know, my father giving me a giant notebook, you know, maybe 6 or 7, and, you know, he told me to draw on it. So I, you know, drew, you know, probably a Ninja Turtle, and then he showed it to him, and then he was like, that's good, now finish the page. And so from very young, that kind of instilled in me that kind of discipline of creating something and finishing it. You know, then you go to high school and you don't do anything, you know, fall into other things. And then somewhere along the line, my art teacher, Dale Meddy, kind of gave me enough, you know, credibility, and he nominated me for the Oscar House Summer Art Institute in Vermilion, South Dakota. It's a 2-week program that was geared towards Native children, high school students. And so that's kind of my earliest, you know, professional recollection of seeing Native professional artists and allowing them to teach me and show me that you can do art as a career and as a professional choice. So I kind of, you know, took it from there. You know, there was like, you know, you can go to college and you can do art as a career choice, and I kind of never looked back.
We notice in lots of your work, the humans have extra limbs. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, a lot of my work deals with how can I convey motion, or, you know, the act of, you know, displacement. So it's one of these things where I'm trying to, you know, depict that, or how can I show you, you know that, you know, how can I convey that action? So I think, the combination of having the limbs, I think you put that together, that there's a motion, your eye moves from up to down, left to right. And so it kind of, places the action on you as a performative aspect. So, you think of it as, oh, they're moving, oh, there's legs that are kind of circling down, or this guy's arm is, swinging, or the young lady is, putting up the peace sign, but her hand's on her hip, So there's these kinds of different things that I'm trying to activate in terms of how can I depict that, or what's the best way to convey it, especially through figures, the act of trying to, show multiple limbs that, you kind of see that articulation of what is happening.
I'm going to cheat. I have two questions, okay? Question one, you talked about ledger art, and I've always been curious how ledger art, the actual paper, changed the art that was created as opposed to maybe on birch bark, et cetera, and composition or whatever way it might be. Question one. The other one's very different. You talked about the position of a person kind of dictating the grammar, something was said. Did I understand you correctly?
I can't hear that second question. You got to a little closer.
Yeah. As I heard one of your comments, it sounded like whether a person standing, sitting, or moving dictates what's called the grammar of a sentence. And I hope you can talk more about that.
Okay. Well, the first question was about ledger art and how I can, what I do to, further that historically in terms of that. For myself, I think, having, friends and peers who do ledger art, I feel like, a lot of them have done everything, especially contemporary ledger arts. So in that way, it's like, how can I further, the next stage? If they're doing, the contemporary lifestyles of their people, in what way can I move the whole genre forward? And I feel like I'm doing that through, that conversation with art history. So I think, utilizing them, get back into like the birch bark and stuff like that. They have the same qualitative, aesthetics as they initially had in terms of, painting on rawhide or buckskin or birch bark. And so, that Plains graphic art, the conceptual aesthetics of that are still very much prevalent, but it's just the access to materials is what's, is how it changed. And, nowadays we kind of utilize that. Everybody can find some paper and draw on it, but in what way are we going to move that forward? And then the second question was the the positionals on our language, yeah. So we're our language is perception based of how we perceive things. So, if you're sitting, obviously you're sitting, but we have the positional to talk to you while you're sitting. I wouldn't talk to you using the standing positionals, obviously you're sitting. So there's, kinds of those things that we have to be conscious of and aware of within our own, cultural aspects of translation.
Okay, from a cultural standpoint, obviously artwork played a big part in your culture, but like home life. So like so your family, was art a big thing, as like painting, collage?
Yeah. My mother does beadwork and regalia. Like a very young age, I can recall her making shawls and making dance regalia, and kind of having me model those things. Come over here. You got a big head. And, put the dance outfit on me, and okay, that works. And cut the ribbons or the string or the yarn, and put the shawl, and then okay, this is about tall as they are. And so very early on, I was influenced by what she was doing culturally, especially her use of colors and whatnot. So that's kind of the one of the bigger cultural influences. My mother's and aunts and whatnot. And then my father was a welder, so he had a very skilled technique in terms of how he expressed himself. I always heard, he did good divots or whatever, I'm not sure of the vernacular, but I heard he was good in that realm too. So I think, just early on, I've always kind of had that. My brothers all kind of draw and all do, various artistic things as well. Beadwork, stitching, making, different cultural artifacts and whatnot. So it's an ongoing thing that we're always kind of, a lifelong learning process in terms of how we are learning and accessing this knowledge. Yeah.
So, Henry, I'm really upset about what's happening with ICE and people being removed from their homes and workplace and churches and schools and taken to other parts of our country or out of our country. And when I looked at your work with the property of the U.S. government and the works that reference the military and your people being taken to other parts, how do you see your work helping us to think about what's happening today and helping us to talk about it?
Yeah, I think that's spot on in terms of, the cross-generational aspects of how, we're dealing with these things. A big part of it is, showing these things so that we can, in hopes, not do the same things, but we're doing the same things, So it's one of these things where we have to be very careful in how we articulate, or visualize, these narratives, because they are, cross-generational. And even for myself, it's a very, difficult thing to try to balance because of how, personal and kind of monumental this whole situation is. So for myself, it's a very kind of depressing thing to have to think about in terms of like, oh, it's happening again. It's just not Ho-Chunk people this time. We're moving way past these generational things, but it's always a very difficult and touchy subject. And I hope that the art can, for one, speak to that, but also it's a very kind of tricky situation in terms of how we move forward, kind of referencing that. I really don't have a very good answer for that just because of it's ongoing. And,
So you spoke earlier about symbolism. So I have a question for you about a couple of your pieces. What is the seventh generation, where we start at the bottom and the windshield is you can't see it at all, and then towards the middle it goes to like a sunny setting, and then flips to night, and then is completely obscured at the top. So I'd like to hear about the symbolism of that. But also I was curious about the symbolism. There's only 2 of your pieces that have birds in them. And I was wondering if you could explain that as well.
Okay, that's a lighter note. So the first one I think is what was the first one again? The 7th generation. Okay, that's okay. Yeah, so a lot of these things, like you said, they take reference from Plains graphic art, and it's funny that you would see it from the bottom up. When in actuality it's the top down, so it's kind of like lineage. It's our, the prophecy of the 7 generations. So, 7 generations ago, they were thinking about us, the 7th generation. So it's one of these things where we have to be conscious of the next 7 generations and making sure that we are leaving the earth just as good as we got it. So there's this passing down of things in generations to generations. So it's a quirky way to look at it that way, as like a totem pole, especially having it be Winnebagos, like 7 generations of Winnebagos, as opposed to an ongoing cultural continuity. I think that's kind of what that references. And then the second one. Yeah, I think yeah, I feel like I got to do more crows and birds. Like I think, it's just on an off chance that only 2 of the works had birds in them, I think, but there's other works that have birds. I mean, I don't think that it's anything very specific. It's just these 2 so happen to have birds.
This will be an easy one for you. I saw it in 2 of those pictures you made. They had cages or domes or something, especially on top of one of the Winnebagos, and like that one right there. And then I wonder what the significance of that is. And then the other picture, it's right front and center, and kind of with all the vehicles around it. Is that anything, or?
Those are the frames of our traditional houses. So we have the, instead of, like on the plains here, they live in teepees. We're a woodland people, and we live in domed houses. They're called chipoteques, which is a round house. So that's basically the frame of our traditional households that, we're bringing with us in terms of like we're bringing our culture. The Winnebago here, we're literally bringing our baggage with us, and it's covered up, we're under the guise of the Winnebago motorhome. So I think, and the other one, yeah, in front with the Winnebago camp, it's just on the outside. We're kind of enclosing in the Sioux people or the Omaha people. We're surrounding them in terms of being removed to the plains, and then we still have our houses on the outside. So yeah, that was a little bit easier. Thank you.
And over here?
Okay, from when your people changed from the woodlands to the Great Lands, is that what?
The Great Plains?
Yeah, Great Plains. How? Okay, the artwork, like from being in one area to another area, did it change drastically, or did it like kind of stay similar?
Oh, you're talking about like historical artworks?
Yes, historical.
Yeah, I think that's always a big part of it because of how, these what they're called traditional cultural properties, of being relocated to different areas. They don't always have the best records. For example, in Minnesota, I'm sure they just burned a lot of our stuff after they exiled us. And who knows what we had left when we got to South Dakota. So there's like gaps where things weren't probably happening. And again, that transculturation of modern materials, fabrics and calico and just denim, these different things that we were getting access to was probably rapidly changing that. In terms of like, the Field Museum in Chicago houses a lot of stuff post 1860s. So a lot of that stuff was either acquired legally or taken. So these things were an ongoing cultural kind of diffusion that was happening. So I think that woodland. If you look at art historically of the Great Plains, that influx of tribes that was being moved westward developed what was called the prairie style. So there's the prairie style of doing beadwork. And so there's that sharing of cultural knowledge from the tribes that were being pushed westward amongst each other. So it kind of became a new kind of art form that was developed post-reservation period.
And I'll take the last question or opportunity to give Henry a prompt. Henry, you have 2 Winnebagos on the side with you there. Can you talk about how those travel with you? And they do have some placement in the gallery as well.
Yeah, the Winnebagos here. So these are the, I frequent the antique stores and see what I can collect. The small one here, I take with me everywhere I go, and it stands in as a self-portrait or a selfie for all you youngins. But I kind of place it in front of prominent landscapes and landmarks and take it with the iPhone, from the bottom up. So this will be on view on the video screen downstairs in the atrium there, of all the different locations I traveled to throughout, Canada and the United States. And it basically stands in for myself when I don't want to show my face. And these ones are the ones that I've find at the antique stores and just kind of collect now. as a way to collect Winnebagos. You know, it's a weird kind of juxtaposition of a Winnebago man collecting Winnebago toys, and you know, it's so I mean, it kind of adds to, you know, this eccentricity of being an artist.
Well, we love the eccentricity of artists, so we really thank you for being here today, being here all week with us. Henry taught some classes for students in the Des Moines Public Schools. He participated in the opening last night and has been very generous, so let's give Henry a round of applause. And the museum is open, so please head up into the exhibition and make sure you go down to that atrium in the Richard Meyer building to see the canoe and a couple of the Winnebago photographs. Thank you, everyone.